Not to say for those who are staying here, but we're all staying here today. But go ahead and get your Bible out. We read this verse earlier together as we've been studying through Philippians, as the second chapter, verses 12 to 18. In this series we're calling Be Encouraged, and in particular, sort of living out our faith and how we do that and let God live in and through us. I don't know how you are, but most of us like to receive compliments whenever we deserve them. And Paul, in this section, was sort of dishing out some compliments. He complimented the believers in ancient Philippi when he told them, "You've always obeyed." I mean, that's a pretty good compliment to someone who had been doing so like they were. He was referring how they had taken what he had taught them about being the church and applied it into their lives, and how through that, through keeping those instructions, well, things were getting better for them, getting better for their church and the people around them. He said, even, we'll find out more in our study later, in the matter of their giving. You know, sometimes when you start telling people how to manage their money, they tend to say, hey, you've gone from preaching to meddling and just, back away. But Paul, and we'll find out later in this study, he said, hey, there are some people in Judea who are Christians and they're suffering. And while you don't have much, if you just start taking a little bit at a time and build it up over time, then you're going to have a great gift that you can send to them. You guys should do that. They're like, great, we'll do that. And so Paul was just saying, man, you guys are so good. You've just been obeying everything. You've been putting it into practice. This is really great. And then he embellished that compliment when he said, not only when I was sort of looking over your shoulder were you being obedient, but you were even doing it when I was absent. There are people, I'm told, who are good about obeying when those in authority over them are present, but really not so much about being obedient whenever that authority is absent. If it wasn't so, we wouldn't have the farmer's wisdom of when the cat's away, the mice will play. Nor would we have John Wooden's wisdom. If you don't know him, he was a rather successful UCLA basketball coach who once said, the true test of a man's character is what he does when no one is watching. There is something, I guess, permissive about being in a situation where you don't think anybody will find out what you think or what you say or what you do. It kind of frees you to cast aside what you've been doing in order to please others or to stay out of trouble and finally get to do what you really want to do. Paul argued in this letter to the believers in Rome and to the believers in Galatia, separate from the one we're reading out today, that the law of Moses sort of functioned that way. It was God's given authority. It was good, but as much as God's people didn't want to get in trouble, as much as God's people wanted to please him, they still ended up choosing their own desires over his directions. Maybe not all the time, but enough. And God said even once was enough. Some of these people even devised ways to look like they were keeping the law and they were being righteous when in fact they were just furthering their own desires. Jesus often pointed this out when he was confronting those who didn't think they needed to be forgiven because, well, they hadn't broken any laws. And Jesus said, well, that's really not true. Jesus pointed out how they now understood the laws was in a way that kept them from keeping the laws, and they actually knew better. They really were guilty. They needed to be forgiven even if they thought themselves righteous. So yeah, they needed to be forgiven. You may not realize it, but when you start talking about the issue of integrity, it reveals the difference of what the Bible reveals about us as people and what the majority of the world think about people today. King David expressed the sort of the biblical view of people whenever he said, there is no one who does right, not even one. That's from Psalms 14 and Psalms 53. It gets quoted in Paul's letters. The sort of the biblical perspective of things is that we have a longing to do what's wrong when the authority is not around. But in the world, there are philosophers like Rousseau, and there are socialists like Marx, and there are psychologists like Erich Fromm, which you might have been hearing about lately in our sort of national discussion, who are people who say that by nature, we're inherently good. They say people are just really good. They believe that the only thing that people really need is for them to really just discover their own values. And we just need to help them clarify what those internal values are. After all, if these people are really left by themselves and no one is sort of influencing them, their heart of hearts is going to lead them to do by nature what's right. Of course, they also advocate that we kind of have to change our definition of good to include the things that these people by nature want to do. And so we just have to sort of expand that definition a little bit so that all these people who are doing things by nature are in the good category. It was pointed out to me this last week as I was studying through of a recent study of kids. Now, they're all on vacation right now, so it's probably a good time to talk about them. So I was told that 24% of children as young as kindergarten admit when they were asked to lying and cheating and stealing. 24% of kindergartners. That was kind of a high percentage. And then this study went on to talk about the percentage of middle schoolers. It was up to 90% who said that they did the same thing. Those who got caught, of course, did get in trouble, but this article was advocating that they were only acting that way because, well, they were worried about not getting good grades. So they really had something good at heart. They really wanted to get good grades, and that's a good thing. And just because they had to lie or cheat or steal or plagiarize, well, we just need to include that in those natural things because they were really wanting something good. Those aren't bad things in themselves. It was just a way for them to get what they needed. I mean, they're just following that great football coach's admonition, if you aren't cheating, you're not trying. Well, that sounds like a great definition of good, doesn't it? Reveals that the heart of man is really nice. There was something different about the believers in Philippi, noticeably different than the world around them. They were doing the right thing, and they weren't just doing it because they were afraid of Paul and his authority. They were doing it because something had changed in them. They were no longer the old people they once were. They were no longer like the rest of the world around them. They had come to know Jesus, and Jesus had changed them. They had become people who really wanted to do what was right. Their nature had changed. And even when they were left alone, their nature was to do what was right, even if they failed to do what was right sometimes. Now, in his letter to the believers in Galatia, Paul would describe this change was the result in people, giving up what he would call the works of the flesh and adopting what he called the fruits of the Spirit. That's in the 5th chapter. He was trying to describe this change of no longer being like the people in the world. Paul followed up this compliment of them being different than the world because they were obedient, because they had a change in their lives with a command. I don't know how you are when someone gives you a command, but he gave this to them in the imperative. This was something they needed to do. Paul told them, with fear and trembling, work against your notion of self-salvation. Now you might recall that if you read your English translations, that what Paul said was, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. That's how it comes across in almost all the English translations that I checked. I've always been told that this phrase was Paul's way of saying that each of us are responsible for how we live after we've been saved. And we need to be very careful about that. That we need to, even with fear and trembling, make sure we make the right choices lest we make the wrong choices. And if we do, we might lose that salvation. But I don't know if that's really the best way to understand this passage. So I want us to sort of begin our study of it by just asking a simple question. What did Paul actually say? What did he mean? The word God led Paul to use that gets translated to work is a compound word. It's two parts. The first part of it means down or against, and the second part is to work. To produce, to do, to accomplish. So the basic meaning of this word is actually to work against something. Whenever it's used in a positive sense in the New Testament, it referred to the effort it takes to work against something, as in the sense that you're working real hard, and because of that hard work, you're going to overcome whatever that obstacle is. So this word often gets translated as to accomplish or to bring about or to produce against the odds. But this seems like an odd word whenever you're talking about salvation. To work against one's own salvation, I mean, that's kind of what it says. So that's like, wow, that's really weird. So we might need to know what sort of salvation that Paul was talking about that we need to be working against. And yes, the word here for salvation is the typical word for salvation you find throughout the Bible. It's the word sozo, which literally meant to make whole. Sometimes this word gets used to talk about people that Jesus heals. And it gets translated, Jesus healed them, but it says Jesus sozos them. Jesus saves them. He takes what is broken and he makes it new again by his power that defies the natural order of things. When we are saved, we're made whole again. We move from the broken state to that of amended state. We get made new again. And only God can, in that sense, save us. He is the only one who can make us whole again from our broken state. He's the only one with the power that can make us a new creature in Christ, by where we long for what is good rather than that old nature that longs for what is wrong. A person who can force themselves to do good things cannot by doing so mend what's broken in their lives. Even if they ended up with doing more good things than more bad things. I mean, even if they had that kind of discipline and they got a whole bunch of good stuff, and we had one of those little weights things, they put all their good stuff over here and it was sinking down, all their bad stuff was going up because they had more good things in their life, they still wouldn't be able to mend that brokenness, that they still longed to do what was wrong, and they were just letting this authority keep them in fear and working over them. They still weren't changed. What do broken people do? Even broken people who are good most of the time, whenever the threat of being punished is removed. I mean, you could just ask Adam and Eve. They weren't even in a broken state, were they? When the authority that keeps us honest isn't around anymore, we tend to become vulnerable to that inner desire that wants us to do what is not right. And it opens us up to being persuaded by those who tell us that they really know what's best for us, because it lines up with that inner desire. You see, that's what Satan did with Adam and Eve. Satan said, God's not going to let you die. He just doesn't want you to eat from that tree, because if you do, then you'll be just like God, because then you'll know the difference between evil and good, and he's not going to be needed to be around to tell you what's good or wrong, because, well, you get to do that. What a great lie. Sounds reasonable. We really don't need God to tell us right from wrong, because, well, we know the difference. But just because you know the difference doesn't mean that anything has changed. And it doesn't mean that you're going to choose what is good. That still inner desire is going to be choosing the wrong things. They were the very first ones to be broken by sin, certainly not the last. Every one of their descendants had that same problem. It isn't that we can't do good things now and then, or even occasionally, or even under duress. It's just that doing good things is against our nature. And only God can change our nature. And the good news is that He has a way to make that happen. He longs to change us and change that nature. He can and will make us whole again if we trust Him to do so. And in that process, the broken person dies and that new person is born from above, a person whose nature is, well, good, because God has created it in us. And He's filled us with His Spirit. That doesn't mean that born-again people don't ever do bad things. It's just now that those bad things are against our nature of wanting to do what's good. As people are changed and they start doing good because that's now their nature, life for themselves get better and lives around them get better because they're helping themselves and showing God's love and expressing God's love, and life really is getting better. Those in that ancient church in Philippi had started doing good things. They were being obedient, and things in their lives were getting better, and things in the lives of the people around them were getting better. They would probably even have been adopting some of the things we find in the law of Moses because they're good things, and been doing some of those things, not because they had to follow the law, but because, well, they wanted to do things God's way. And whenever you get in that place where you're doing good things and you're seeing the difference of doing those good things, you start thinking by, I'm really doing pretty good here. Look at me. Look at all these good things that I'm doing, and because I'm doing these things, look at all this wonderful stuff that's happening because I'm being obedient. Man, I'm just doing so well. If I could just get other people to do the things that I'm doing, hey, wouldn't that be good? I mean, I'm doing it, making a difference, and I'll just get you to do it too, and then you can make a difference too, and that's just the way it should be. Rather than giving God the credit for completely transforming our lives so we can do what is good. And inviting those people to experience that same transformation in their lives so they can do good. They're not going to be able to follow our example any more than anyone else until God changes their lives. The context, the original Greek word order of verse 12 of what Paul was trying to say is something that can help us understand what he was talking about. The context is kind of simple. Paul wanted them to keep obeying his encouragement to adopt Christ's attitude. That's what he'd been talking about. You need to put on Christ. You need to have his attitude. You need to be doing the things that Christ would do, whether I'm there or whether I'm not there, and then your life as church together is just going to keep getting better and better. And the only reason they could do that is because Christ had transformed them, and he was excited about that and what was taking place. But now the hard part of this understanding, a Greek grammar lesson, and I apologize for that in some regards, but I want you to listen to it. I know for a lot of people, grammar doesn't interest anyone, not even the English grammar, much less Greek grammar. But I feel I should point out a couple of things. Paul used the feminine form of the word translated salvation in verse 12, and the masculine form for everything else in verse 12. So there's a difference between what he was saying about salvation and what he was saying about everything else that comes across because of this gender. Now, it doesn't come across in English because English doesn't use gender, and so that it seems like you're talking a foreign language, and well, they were talking Greek. Greek doesn't come across the same way. So I want you to listen to the Greek word order, and I'm going to give you the gender of each word. And so it says, with fear, that's in the masculine, and trembling, that's in the masculine. And they don't always include articles, but he intentionally put an article in here, and the article is feminine. And then of yourselves, and that's in the masculine, and it's not just a possessive of yourselves, but it's talking about the person. And then salvation, which is in the feminine, and then work against, which is in the masculine. So we have with fear and trembling, the of yourself salvation, work against, when you put it all together. I'm sure you understand the fear and trembling part. whatever it is that Paul wanted these ancient believers to do, they needed to do it with great care. They needed to do it as if something wasn't going to go right if they didn't do it right. The picture that came to me was those guys who disarm bombs. I don't know why that came to mind, but it just came to mind. I mean, when I think of those guys and they're trying to do the right thing in there, I mean, if they get the wrong thing, it kind of blows up. So those are a little fear and trembling and making sure they're doing this. So we understand the idea that just means to do it carefully. That means to do it with great concern. I found it interesting that the "thee" was separated from the salvation. And it was separated by this descriptor of the self, the kind of salvation. The salvation of yourself. Which should make us wonder, what does that mean, the of yourself salvation? We can understand how we should work against something like that. Paul has said when these ancient believers adopted Christ's attitude, treating each other as Christ would treat them, their life together that was bringing about the kind of harmony that Paul envisioned and that we heard about earlier. It said if you really do this, you really will become one. You'll be moving in the same direction. You'll have the same heart. You'll have the same Paul. You'll be going in the same direction. But you need to be careful that you don't end up thinking that you're the reason all of this is happening. You need to be careful thinking that you're the one who's made your life whole. That you're the one who's making things better. It's not that way at all. But it's easy to get thinking that way. You know, after all, they were the ones who adopted Christ's attitude. They were the ones who were putting it into practice. They were the ones who were making it happen. Look all these good things that I am doing and the result of the good things that I'm doing. But Paul wanted them to recognize that nothing could be further from the truth. They needed, with fear and trembling, to work against that false idea that they were somehow making themselves whole because of what they had done and what they were doing. It's an easy trap. Paul clearly points out in verse 13 the real reason that changes were taking place. They're being made whole. Again, remember, that's that word for salvation, to be made whole from a broken state. And they were being made whole from a broken state as the church because God was at work in them. And God was willing in them. It's a similar but different word. It gets translated in English, work for both verses, but this is not work against. God is just working. Paul was pointing out that through their obedience in God's ways, which was a result of their changed life, God was working in them, willing in them, accomplishing things through them. They were sort of like the tools in his hands. God was the willing, working person who was accomplishing things for his own good pleasure. So why are things going well in your life? Bob Russell, you may not know him, he's a retired preacher now. He served a small congregation in Kentucky that grew phenomenally. I mean, it went from being a small congregation to running over 25,000 people. It was one of the early super churches. And whenever you hear about a church doing that, it makes you wonder, well, what are they doing? How come they're doing that? We want that here. What's going on there? And so, man, preachers from all over would come up and say, hey, Bob, how did you make this happen? I mean, we want to do the same thing. We want to learn from you. And he had to answer lots and lots of questions. He finally said, you know, I think I'll just write a book and we can distribute it so everybody can know about it. And he titled his book, When God Builds a Church. He says, yeah, I had a part to play. I did things, but it really wasn't about me. I sort of feel like I was just in the right place at the right time. I think I was just being obedient to the things that God had called me to do. And he is the one who really did this. And so I don't know how to explain to you how that works. Now, he had all kinds of chapters over leadership and worship and calling. I mean, all the stuff you'd expect in a church administration kind of manual. But he was like, it really wasn't what I was doing. It's what God was doing. And really, that's the only way a church gets built. It's Christ's church. He builds the church. Now, we may not be able to build a church, but Paul pointed out to these ancient believers in Philippi that we can certainly ruin one. That's why Paul emphasized in verse 14 that there were still some worldly attitudes that these transformed believers were holding on to and they needed to get rid of because it wasn't in keeping with their new nature. They needed to get rid of grumbling, and they needed to get rid of disputing. Imagine a church without grumbling and disputing. That's what Paul envisioned. The resulting change among them when they did so would evidence that they were not guilty of acting like the world around them. You see, sometimes we look at the world and we say, hey, the world's doing good out there. We just bring those worldly principles into the church and things are going to go good here. And it doesn't really work that way. He wanted them not to be guilty. He wanted them to be blameless of acting like the world. And we want to be the same way. He wanted them to act like the children of God instead of Satan's children. He said, whenever that takes place, you're going to stand out. You're going to stand out like candles in the darkness. You're going to stand out like stars in the sky. It's going to be noticeably different than the world around us. Paul then encouraged them to keep holding on to the word of life. You use that for their foundation, their faith, their practice, their direction. Hold on to what Christ has revealed to us. And so that as we put it into practice, God will be at work in and through our lives to bring about good things. He wanted to see that continued, what we would say, continued obedience to the gospel. And he said, if that happens, life is going to be good. He said, I'm writing from prison, and even if I died in prison and you kept being obedient to God or your situation and I was being obedient to God in my situation, then I will know that my time with you wasn't spent in vain. Not his time in training them to do exactly what he said, but his time in bringing them to the Lord so that they could be transformed, so they would have that change of nature, so they would desire to do what God had. That's the talk that wasn't in vain. They had received good news and trusted God and been transformed. Paul wanted them to understand that even if he were to die, he could still rejoice. He compared what would happen to one of the offerings at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, since he was writing to people who weren't from Jerusalem, and he was writing to people who weren't really even Jewish per se, he probably had to explain this to them at some point. And so he's probably just reminding them of what he'd already taught them. We are sort of disconnected from it. They would have sacrifices at the temple in which there would be the main sacrifice, and it was an offering that was pleasing to God. And then they would add their other offering on top of it, this drink offering. It would get poured out over the top of it, and so together it would offer even more aroma up. And that's what Paul's talking about. You guys have your sacrifice, and he compares theirs to kind of like the big main sacrifice. And then I have mine, which is kind of like the drink offering. And together, it still brings a fragrant offering to God because we're his people and we've humbled ourselves to accept him. And he has transformed us. And now we long to do things his way. What a pleasing fragrance to God. So we do sometimes have to work against that idea of self-salvation and understand it is all by God. And that we long to do things his way, not because we're so darn good, but because God has transformed us into people who long for that good. So if we're really transformed people and we were left alone, we would long to do what's good. If that's not your inner longing, then maybe you need God to transform your life, so it will be. We have a hymn of invitation that we'll be using. One that says, God, I need you to change me. Would you please stand?